Every revolution starts in the minds of the people.
Arm yourself for the war of ideas. Take back your life. Take back your liberty. Tom Mullen Talks Freedom.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Tom Mullen Talks Freedom. Today is Sunday, December 8th, and an unfortunate anniversary, the anniversary of the death of John Lennon. Something I wanted to mention because we've got some pretty momentous things to talk about today. And I did have a whole episode dedicated to the anniversary of Pearl Harbor that I recorded yesterday. And because of the events that occurred overnight for us here in the United States and during the morning and early afternoon overseas, I bring you this special edition, this special weekend edition of Tom Mullen Talks Freedom. And the big news, of course, is that Damascus, the capital of Syria, has fallen. Unconfirmed reports, well, confirmed, I believe, reports are that President Bashar al-Assad has fled the country. It's unconfirmed that his plane went off radar and that he may have been assassinated by persons unknown, although we could probably come up with some suspects. Of course, I learned all this just before I fell asleep last night on X. I searched the news, of course, they're way behind, and whatever they end up telling you, the national news media, will be the empire's propaganda. You know, I've had people on to talk about what's going on with Syria in the past. Of course, that's been off the radar until the last few weeks. And just to kind of put this in perspective, you know, this is, of course, an operation by the U.S. empire. It looks like working with so-called ally Turkey, or at least they're a frenemy in this effort so far, and in empowering former President Obama's and the late Senator John McCain's so-called moderate rebels to take over the country. So freedom will reign in Syria. And if you believe that one, you know, these are the people that the empire was arming a decade ago. And just to pull back on, for those of you who haven't been with me for all 10 years now, the podcast has only been going since late 2021, but I've been writing about this for over a decade. And I was wrong about one thing, and I'll post a link to this article. I did say 8 years ago that Russia would never give up its ports in Syria and Ukraine. And at the time, it was during the 2016 elections where Hillary Clinton was quite insanely proposing no-fly zones over Syria while Russian planes were flying in Syria airspace at the Syrian government's invitation to defend itself against these so-called moderate rebels, who are also known, by the way, as Al-Qaeda in Syria or ISIS. Take your pick. I mean, it's all the same people, and it's all the same insane, savage, fundamentalist ideology. So these are the people we've put in charge. If it's true that Assad has been assassinated, then once again, the empire can say, as Hillary Clinton did after Libya, after Gaddafi was brutally murdered, we came, we saw, he died, and then the insane cackle. And of course, you know, after the empire gets done with one of these, nobody ever goes back and looks at how did that country fare after. You know, does anyone care about Libya now? Slavery's made a big comeback there. Slave markets right on the streets. I don't know if that's the case this minute, but it has been since the empire toppled Gaddafi. Not to say Gaddafi was a good guy. And, you know, there are no good guys. The Russian government is evil. The Syrian government is evil. The one they deposed is evil. The new one coming in is evil. The Israeli government's evil. The Lebanese government's evil. The United States government is evil. Now, you know, this might sound crazy radical, but it's actually One of the founding principles of the United States, it's one of the first things Thomas Paine says in his Common Sense when he's trying to make his argument that the United States should be independent from Great Britain. He says that government, even in its best state, is a necessary evil, and in its worst state, an intolerable one. So the United States, and this is the pamphlet that mainstream historians credit with convincing the Americans who did support independence to support independence. So this is by no means a radical idea. Governments are evil. Are they a necessary evil? Well, that's a point of disagreement between the so-called minarchist libertarians and the anarcho-capitalist libertarians. At best, it's a necessary evil that should be limited. I mean, Paine goes on to say in his essay, not that he's the last word on everything, but he goes on to say that people form governments and give up a portion of their property for preservation of the rest. You know, just another guy at that time channeling John Locke, as were all the founders around the Revolution. Not so much so when they did the Constitution. But the other unconfirmed report, and it may be confirmed by the time you hear this, is that Russia has indeed evacuated Tartus, the port that they've had in Syria for many decades. And if you know, when you pull back and look at the geopolitics of this and look at a map of Eurasia, it's pretty apparent what the empire has been up to. So one of the historic challenges for Russia has always been ice-free ports. They don't have very many of them, really none um, in the within the Russian borders that remain ice-free all winter. So this has always been a challenge. Now, Ukraine, back when it was the Ukraine and within the Russian borders, was one of them. Crimea, they have a port at Sevastopol, which the empire tried to take away from them in 2014. They and getting back to my original point, if you pull back, there were two regime change operations going on in 2014. Of all the 180 countries in the world, the empire had humanitarian reasons for overthrowing the governments of Ukraine and Syria. And the two places where Russia has ice-free ports on this side of the Eurasian continent just happen to be in Ukraine and Syria. And they weren't successful in overthrowing Assad in 2013, 14. I think they started that one in 2011. They were successful in overthrowing the Ukrainian government in 2014. And one of the first things that the new government, the U.S. puppet government, tried to do was take away the Russians' port at Sevastopol, renege on, I think it's a 99-year lease that the Russians have to keep their Black Sea fleet in Sevastopol. And that's what provoked Putin to go into Ukraine and eventually annex it, or into Crimea, and eventually annex it. And then, you know, Assad was able to hold out until last night. It looks like they've toppled that. And if it's true that the Russians have given up one of those port in Tartus, then that's a strategic win for the empire, and they will be beating their chests and high-fiving themselves about it. I suspect, and there's a lot of noise about this among people who know what they're talking about, like our friend Daniel McAdams over at the Ron Paul Institute, that this is part of some sort of back channel deal. At first, Daniel was tweeting that, do you still say tweeting, or is it Xing? I don't know. Still was speculating that perhaps the Russians had sold out Assad, their ally, to keep the port at Tartus. And maybe they did, but if they did evacuate it, then the likely deal made by Putin was that they would allow Syria to be overthrown if the West agreed to cease funding Ukraine. And what do you know? Mike Johnson, the pseudo revolutionary Speaker of the House, really the fallback after they tried to get somebody that's really America first in there. He has refused to bring new Ukraine funding to a vote, meaning they're not going to get it. Now, I think Biden is trying to send as much already appropriated money over there and weapons. I think he's made an order for the Defense Department, maybe even to ship weapons itself to Ukraine in a last gasp effort to keep it going as long as possible before he leaves office. But there won't be any new funding unless something changes. And maybe that's the deal. And again, I mean, the empire will say this is a strategic win because of Russia's two ports on this side of the Eurasian continent. We got them to give up one of them. Now, where those ships will go, I don't know. How Putin may retaliate in the future, we don't know. What we do know is that no Americans benefit from this. Well, a very small percentage. I mean, not even approaching 1% benefit from this because they make money off of it. But the vast majority of Americans don't benefit from the empire. It doesn't matter, it make a difference in their lives whether Assad is in control of Syria, whether Iran is powerful or not in the Middle East. And a lot of this is about weakening Iran for whatever reason. I mean, I can give you the reason the way these so-called elites think. And it's the old conventional wisdom that whoever controls the Eurasian continent controls is the dominant power in the world. But it doesn't benefit American taxpayers to have their military be the dominant power in the world. This is all mercantilist thinking. It's all imperial thinking. Don't forget that America became the richest country in the world during the 19th century by not being involved in any of this, by not having an overseas empire, by not fighting in foreign wars, by not being necessarily the most powerful country in the world. It was the potentially most powerful, but it only really fought to defend itself, other than that land grab they did against Mexico. But at least that was contained within the Americas. Of course, we fought with each other for 4 years to our great detriment during the Civil War, another unnecessary war. But for the most part, America stayed out of European geopolitics, stayed out of becoming an empire until the Spanish-American War, at least, and one could argue until after World War II. And Americans were much better off, and there was much more exponential economic growth. We were talking 3% during the Industrial Revolution. We were talking many, many times more than that. So we'll see how this plays out. It's definitely going to be a tragedy for Syria. It's going to be good for Israel. Of course, they're very influential here. And, you know, I know I'll start getting the emails from the Jews people. You know, yes, the Israel lobby is powerful because the empire allows it to be powerful. It's in the empire's interest to build up Israel and allow it to expand territorially, which it wants to do. And of course, to support the hardline party of Benjamin Netanyahu. Now, there's an even harder line minority party in Israel that is even more aggressive. Okay. So they have an influence in all this. And there's lots of speculation about so-called Greater Israel. I mean, the fact remains Israel is in Gaza, supposedly defending itself for the death of 1,000 or so Israelis in October of 2023. I don't know how many thousands or tens of thousands they've killed in Gaza, but it's a little like the U.S. defending itself after 3,000 Americans died on 9/11. Somewhere around 1 million Middle Easterners who had nothing to do with it dead later. I would say that, you know, were defended long before that, actually. But of course, we here at Tom Mullen Talks Freedom, host and audience, don't have any illusions that this is about defense. So we'll see what happens with Syria. I'm sure there's tragedy awaits as it awaited in Libya when the empire toppled that government. Whether or not that strategically helped them, we'll see. Just because the empire has strategic goals and sometimes succeeds in them doesn't mean that they're smart or that their strategic goals are right, even by their own standards. Okay. So, they did greatly empower Iran by toppling Iraq. So that was a big mistake in every direction. It didn't agree with our principles and it didn't even agree with its own principles. So we'll see how they do with toppling Syria. Now, of course, they get to build a pipeline that they've wanted to put through Syria for quite a long time. And that had a lot to do with cutting off Russia. So, I've always argued that Russia is the main target of most of the empire's interventions in the Middle East. And I argued that 8 years ago. I still would argue that they wanted to, of course, not allow Russia to build economic ties with Europe, especially with energy. They blew up the Nord Stream pipeline. And I guess one could tie this into Pearl Harbor in this way. It's another example, the Russian invasion of Ukraine being the American empire badgering a world leader into firing the first shot. Now, that's what they did with Mexico to start the Mexican-American War. That's what they did with the Spanish, if you believe that the Spanish blew up the Maine in the first place. Certainly, that's what FDR did with the Japanese. So he comes out, makes his famous speech, calls it a dastardly attack, that even while they were talking about peace, they had already brought their navy to within striking distance of Pearl Harbor. And that was actually all true. I mean, again, we can't ever make the mistake of thinking that because the U.S. government is evil, that the Japanese government isn't also evil. And ultimately, the American public and the Japanese public are responsible for acquiescing to that evil. But Japan, claims, oh my gosh, we're so humiliated. We didn't intend for this attack to occur while we were negotiating peace. But what did they really intend? They intended that the minute that it was no longer possible to achieve peace with Washington, that they would immediately declare war and attack the United States like the same hour or the same day. By no means would it have not been a surprise attack. Now, again, there's all kinds of speculation that FDR wasn't surprised at all by the attack and maybe he even allowed it to happen. I can't prove that, but there's a lot of people who say that's what happened. He certainly wanted a war with not Japan. He wanted to get into the European war. And Japan was his gateway because if he got Japan to fire the first shot, like Lincoln got the Confederates to fire the first shot, like Polk got the Mexicans to fire the first shot, then he would have his pretext for war with Japan. And therefore, he would be in a war with Germany and the rest of the Axis powers. Do I have that right, Axis? Or is that World War One? I always forget that. The Germans, the Austrians, the Italians, etc. So, FDR achieved what he wanted. He got into World War One. He didn't fire the first shot, but he cut off Japan's oil and seized all their financial assets. This must sound familiar. It's not a one-to-one comparison between badgering Putin into invading Ukraine, but it's history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes, right? So FDR got his war, the war that the American public vehemently opposed up until the attack on Pearl Harbor. And this was to Japan's great detriment. Of course, they would have been far better off by not attacking the United States. I don't know what they would have done because they were dependent on the United States oil. They could have left Manchuria and, cried uncle. Now, you could say, well, all kinds of arguments against that, but they had no business being in Manchuria. Of course, I shared on social media the article from the late, great Will Grigg that it was actually FDR's distant cousin, the god awful Teddy Roosevelt, who secretly encouraged them to go into Manchuria in the first place. Okay. So maybe I'll post a link to that. There's so many links to post with this serious story and so many parallels that I don't want to get too crazy. But yes, the US government secretly told Japan, called them the honorary Aryans, to Teddy Roosevelt. You're not white people, but you're the closest thing in Asia. So yeah, be our pet little empire over there, open China's markets, and go ahead and do your worst. And then a few decades later, when Roosevelt, his cousin FDR, after destroying the Constitution with the New Deal in the 1930s, wanted to destroy the rest of the republic by making us into an empire and going into Europe, he used that same invasion as a pretext to badger Japan into firing the first shot and got us into World War II. Not only was it terrible for Japan, it was terrible for the United States. The myth is it was the good war, fascism was defeated. Yay. You know, Somehow they ignore that we funded and enabled the Soviet Union to take over half of Europe, rule it for 46 years, kill at least 3 times as many people as the Nazis did, and probably 5 times as many. They had their own Holocaust before, Hitler even started. They had already killed at least 5 million Ukrainians. So, the Soviets, how this turns out to be a win, how the Soviet Empire, that matzo ball is hanging out there, as they would say on Seinfeld, how you could ignore that. I still have never been able to figure that out. But, the similarities are there. So Putin should not have invaded Ukraine. It's going to turn out badly for him. He's at least lost one of his ports, right? And he doesn't have a lot to lose. He had 2 on this side. They've got one in Vladivostok. It's on the Sea of Japan. And that's only ice free because of the power plants there. It keeps the port warm, or it would be frozen too, like St. Petersburg is during the winter. So, this was not good for Putin. He did have other options before he invaded Ukraine. But again, it wasn't unprovoked. I mean, that's the part that's the lie, the big lie. And Americans are not better off for having provoked Putin into making this strategic error. We would be much better off, and I've been saying this now for how many years has it been? What's this, 2024? At least 30. If we had made friends with Russia, established trade with Russia, not tried to put our boot on their neck, back starting with the Clinton administration. In fact, I just got Scott Horton's book, Provoked, and I've heard a few interviews with him, a few teasers. I haven't read it yet. But he even puts this back to the George H.W. Bush administration, and that makes sense. My memory was that we started expanding NATO under Clinton. Remember that the Soviet Union didn't fall officially until 1991, almost 1992, the last year of H.W. Bush's administration. So we're basically, I'll give the empire, you trying to find your bearings. I mean, this is a real enemy and a real threat for 46 years, one that you, of course, created, but that's nothing new. We've heard that story before. And I'll give them 1 year to figure out how to react. But certainly by 1997, we could have, and with a friendly president in Boris Yeltsin, we could have done a lot better in establishing warm and open trade relations with Russia. And instead, we spent 3 decades trying to reignite the Cold War that had just ended so that Russia could never rise again as a threat. Again, if you want an empire, that's what you do. If you want a free, prosperous republic, that is not what you do. And empires fall. Empires impoverish their citizens. Okay, don't look at GDP, look at the distribution of wealth. Okay, where is it? It's all in the top 1% more and more every day. That's not the result of capitalism, by the way. There is an unequal distribution of wealth with real capitalism, but it's nowhere near this disproportionate. In fact, the 19th century shows that a freer market, not laissez faire completely, but closer, has more of a leveling effect. And of course, the standards of living under that non-imperial, more laissez-faire economy, the living standards of the bottom 90% skyrocketed. No matter how rich Rockefeller and Morgan got, the working class, as they call it, I don't like that word. I mean, what's the non-working class, by the way? It's Marxist thinking. But the laboring masses, or whatever you want to call them, their lifestyles dramatically improved during that period. I can't say the same since World War II. So that's where we are. We've got to see what's happening. Okay. I'm getting my news on X, like the only place to really go because nothing's suppressed there, or not as much as. You don't get, you get many sides of this. I rely on Douglas McGregor, Colonel Douglas McGregor, who was just on the show, to get good information at least. Um, yeah, one thing I have to make a comment on: Trump, who's trying to keep his anti-war cred intact, puts out this tweet that says, yay, Syria has fallen, Assad's a bad guy, kind of thing, but we shouldn't get involved. This has nothing to do with Americans, and we should stay out of it, which is comical because everybody knows. And Matt Gaetz, who jumped in, and I like Matt Gaetz, he jumps in and says, "Oh, it's so great not to have a warmonger president coming into office." And I reply to that, "Come on, guys, really? Are we going to all pretend that Washington had nothing to do with Syria falling to the head choppers?" And I will say, to be fair, that I did see a post by the purported leader of these moderate rebels telling his forces that they should not, murder the people who surrender. They should not pursue anyone who's fleeing, and they should basically be humanitarian to the defeated here. And that they may have made a deal with the existing military as kind of like the kind of surrender that used to happen during the civilized wars, where it's a agreement between gentlemen. And maybe that's true. And maybe the empire made a deal with the head choppers that said, "Look, we're going to let you go in, take over like we did the Taliban, but you got to play by our rules, or we're going to, we're going to scorch the earth around you once you're in there." That's possible, okay? And I hope that is the case. Not because I like the head choppers of the empire or Assad, but just for the sake of all the innocent people in Syria who won't be killed if that's the case. Let's hope so. Let's hope that Syria looks more like Afghanistan, which is by no means an orderly paradise right now, than it does, though, like Libya, which is in total chaos, still in a civil war after all these years, forgotten by the American public, that part of it that cheered on Hillary Clinton. We saw, he died. Ha 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 ha. So let's hope that there is at least law and order in Syria, and that the various minority groups, the Christians that are there, the Sunni Muslims that are there, who are, certainly in the crosshairs of most of the lunatics who we've loosed upon that country. And hopefully we've bought off their leaders to keep them in control if they can. And, hopefully there's some kind of a deal with Russia and the Ukraine war comes to an end. And, I should comment, the other people that we forget about are the Ukrainian people. So everyone's got a side in this Ukrainian war. The smart people here on Tom Mullen Talks Freedom, we all know this is the empire fighting a proxy war against Russia and that it's really unjustified. So we oppose it, and we oppose the Zelensky regime for its atrocities and for reneging on, Zelensky got elected saying he was going to negotiate. But that has nothing to do with innocent Ukrainian people who, like us, didn't vote for any of this and have been killed in vast numbers, have been conscripted into the war, or even just people who volunteered for the war to defend their country against invaders. I mean, these are all the good guys too, okay? Certainly not among the guilty who provoked the war. So there you have it. That's where we are. Let's see how this plays out. I am going to try to get Janice Kortkamp back. I've been chatting with her on X, and we're fighting our email spam accounts, and hopefully we'll get her on next week. If you remember, she came on and talked about her trip through Syria many years back, and I'd like to get her back to get her thoughts on this. Of course, we'll get Colonel Douglas McGregor back. Everybody wants him. So I will reach out to him to see if he wants to talk about this particular intervention, development. Of course, we left it on his last appearance. I'd like to get him back once Trump's in there to see how he's doing as a supposedly anti-war president who, there's not much daylight between him and the empire on most things. I mean, whatever we get's going to be marginal on the anti-war front. But I do believe that I sincerely still believe this. He has a personal aversion to fighting hot wars. I think he can be talked into a lot of things, including killing individuals, unjustifiably, like he did that Iranian official. He would say is justified. And I said this about Obama and Bush in my writing many years ago, that they're not inherently evil people, but you probably, if they had never been politicians, you probably find them likable. You've got to have charisma to make it to the top. But government makes nice people do very evil things. It convinces you that it's justified to do these things. And I would say that probably a lot of people who work for the empire. So the empire isn't the elected president. It's the permanent employees in the State Department, CIA, and the rest of the so-called intelligence community. That's the empire. And I think, there's a lot of them that believe this is benefiting America. They have the mercantilist imperial outlook and believe that America isn't safe, or America is economically benefits from all this. And of course, we know that the best foreign policy was put forth by Washington and amplified by Jefferson when he said, free friendship with all nations and commerce, entangling alliances with none. That's a paraphrase. And let's hope we can get there one of these days.
The war of ideas has only just begun. Arm yourself with the knowledge you need by heading to TomMullenTalksFreedom.com and subscribing to our email list. And remember, every revolution starts in the minds of the people.